Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to introduce a very great person, a very great friend, Mr. Jim Mars.
Oh.
And Jim, we're glad to have you back, Jim. He's a great guy and a great friend. A little bit about Jim's background. He earned a BA in journalism, and he's worked for several Texas newspapers. He's been an investigative reporter, an award-winning freelance writer and TV producer. He's taught a course on the JFK assassination and wrote a book, Crossfire, the plot that killed Kennedy, which became the basis for the film JFK. Jim's also written Rule by Secrecy and The War on Freedom, and he has appeared on many TV and radio programs, including Coast to Coast, and his most recent book is The Rise of the Fourth Reich. How you like that? In addition, in identifying those who supported Hitler and his Nazis, they managed to there was the influx of post-war Nazis and their National Socialist philosophy into the United States. Jim will answer the following questions and more. Did the Nazis develop and test an atomic bomb before the end of World War II? Were the atomic bombs dropped on Japan of German origin? Did the Nazis recover Solomon's treasure late in the war? Jim Mars will discuss his investigations behind the Nazi movement, both then in Germany and now in the United States, along with what their hidden goals are today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jim Mars.
Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you. Here's your water right here, sir.
Oh, good. Well, it must be this California air. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, especially since I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. I think you guys are probably already on board. Here's what you can't have. This is the new book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich. It's published by William Morrow, which is a subsidiary of HarperCollins, major publisher, real-time stuff. Maybe they'll pay attention to this. I say you can't have it because this is the one and only copy. I only got this the day before yesterday. They are starting to ship, but even the bookstores cannot sell them until the publication date, which is the 24th of this month. So, as usual, I'm $1 short and a day late. But if you find what I'm getting ready to present to you interesting, then I would encourage you to run to your nearest bookstore and pre-order a copy of The Rise of the Fourth Reich, because number one, like Crossfire, like Rule by Secrecy, like my book on UFOs, Alien Agenda, which is the top-selling nonfiction UFO book in the world, has been translated into more than 8-10 languages. This is a book that you're going to want to have as a reference book because it is chock full of stuff. So much stuff, there's no way I could possibly even do justice to all of it today, but I'm going to be hitting the high points. Earlier today, you heard from Eric Phelps, who was telling you about how the Vatican's trying to run everything. You heard from Barry Shamish, who was telling you who killed Rabin and who's trying to run the current government in Israel and who are the people behind them. You heard from Jim Fetzer, who is the past master at knowing all the ins and outs of the 9/11 inside job false flag operation. And you just heard from Clifford Kernicon, who was telling you about what they're doing. They're dropping this stuff on you, and they're causing all of this stuff in the atmosphere, causing all this disease. And so they're all telling you that they are after us, okay? Well, I hope today maybe to put it all together for you, and I'm going to show you who they are, where they came from, and that they haven't really stopped their game plan since the beginning of the 20th century. But first, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, so I'm going to run through some definitions real quick. Reich is simply the German word for empire, okay? Is anybody going to argue with me that the United States today is the new empire in the world, okay? Interestingly enough, in German, when you use the word Reich with a small r, that means rich or wealthy. So actually you could say the Reich is a empire of the wealthy. Fascism and corporatism. Fascism comes, of course, from Mussolini's black-shirted fascistas, which carried the emblem of the axe, the bundled axe, which goes back to the Roman Empire and is the symbol for central authority, okay? And so as a result, the term fascism came into being, meaning tyrannical central authority. But Mussolini himself, as you'll read in my book, said actually fascism probably isn't the correct term. He said the correct term is corporatism, central authority by corporate power. Oops, are we beginning to sound familiar? Now we've got to understand that socialism is a system in which all means of production, distribution, exchange are publicly owned, okay? Now, the globalists really are pushing for socialist systems. It sounds weird. I thought they were capitalist. Well, they are, but they want socialism because any social program, no matter how benevolent, requires central administration, central government, central control, and they know they have the wealth to buy up the central control and thereby run the world. Communism is socialism, okay? But it was one that was exported. This is a classless socialist system in which all property is publicly owned. The problem with socialism as practiced by the communists was they tried to spread it worldwide. They created the International, Workers of the World Unite, okay? Well, the globalists, the financial elite that want to run the world do not want a one world system. If it's a one world system, how can they play one nation off against the other or one economic bloc off against another? And this they have to do because they've learned from the times of the Rothschilds that you play one nation, one economic bloc against each other for power and control. So, what did they do to stop the spread of communism? They created National Socialism. And this goes all the way back. President Abraham Lincoln, you can read it for yourself, I won't read you the whole thing, except right at the end where he says, corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. He understood this. And we'll come back to Lincoln a little bit later on, and we'll see what the parallels are between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Let's go back to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Most of you all are already aware of this. Here's the house on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, where they met and plotted and conspired to push through the Federal Reserve System, which of course is 12 regional banks owned by private banks, which are in turn owned by private stockholders, many of which are not even Americans. It's the international bankers' chokehold on the United States, and one of the men instrumental in doing this was the first chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Paul Warburg. Any of you older people like me who used to read Little Orphan Annie, you might recognize Daddy Warbucks. Daddy Warbucks was fashioned after Paul Warburg. Now, at the time of World War I, Paul Warburg was in charge of the finances in the United States, funding and augmenting our effort, Blackjack Pershing and over there, you know, our boys in World War I. His brother, Max Warburg, was in Germany, instrumental in running the war for Germany. Both of them had been agents for the Rothschilds. Max Warburg was head of M.M. Warburg, principal stockholder in the Reich Bank. He was a co-founder of IG Farben, the largest chemical combine in the entire world, which was the forerunner of what today we call Big Farm, okay, the big, huge pharmaceutical corporations. It was Max Warburg who helped arrange the seal car that went through Germany and took Lenin into Russia to take over the revolution in Russia for the Bolsheviks, which became the communists. He was also a board member of Hamburg America Steamship Line along with Prescott Bush, President Bush's grandfather. Now let's look at the Russian Revolution of 1917. This was verified by Woodrow Wilson. The bulk of financial aid from the United States and from the Bank of England went to the Bolsheviks, the communists. We created communism. Now, why in the world would they do that? Well, it's simple. We saw it within our lifetimes. Early on, they had set out for a program to create what we know as the Cold War, the socialist East versus the capitalist West, and you play them off against each other, and there's an arms race, and there's an economic race, and spies, and all this stuff going on, and for power and control. Lenin would never have gotten to Russia without the help of Max Warburg and the capitalists of the West. Leon Trotsky would have never gotten out of New York and certainly wouldn't have gotten out of the hands of the Canadian authorities except for a special passport from Woodrow Wilson and the approval of Winston Churchill, who was Secretary of the Navy or Admiralty at that time. Okay? So they created communism. And as one writer has said, why would they want to support a system that, whose avowed purpose is to destroy capitalism? And why would they play ball with them? Why would they give them money unless they controlled them? And they did. Again, playing both sides against the middle. Early on, people understood this. In less, dumbed down days, here's a St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 1911 shows Wall Streeters shaking hands with Karl Marx. You got George Perkins, Teddy Roosevelt, John Ryan of National City Bank, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie. They knew that these people were globalist at heart and that they were creating communism, okay? But we don't know that today, do we? Because we're not taught that. And, excuse me, I gotta go watch American Idol. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry, I'm not that dumbed down. I'm trying to speak to y'all, okay? They knew it, but we don't. And folks, French philosopher Georges Santayana had it down exactly correct. If you don't profit from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we're repeating it right now today. Same old stuff, as you'll see. Quickly, let's look at the 10 steps to create an ideal state as offered by Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto. And you can read these for yourself. I'm not going to read them to you. But what you might stop and consider is that this is almost identical to the aims and goals of the old Bavarian Illuminati and practically verbatim for the purposes of the Nazi Party platform. It's all socialism. But like I said, what happened was after they created communism in Russia, the people in Russia got a little taste of freedom and they went wild and they said, we're going to spread this worldwide. And the next thing you knew, there were strong communist parties in Italy, France, England, the United States. And so these globalists grew fearful. We have to do something to stop this. And of course, the way they've made this work all this time is through the Hegelian dialectic, which for you intellectuals is thesis versus antithesis equals synthesis. But for the rest of us, it's problem, reaction, solution. Okay? And George Hegel, was simply trying to come up with a formula to explain human behavior. You want to go see one movie, your wife wants to go see another movie. You have the thesis, she has the antithesis. So then you reach a solution or a compromise. You might, slug it out, or you might toss a coin. And if you're like me and my wife, what usually happens is you end up going and see movie C, which is one you can both agree to. It's not your first choice, but it's a compromise. He came up with this as simply a way of coming up with a formula to explain human behavior. But the globalists took it a step further. Why wait for a problem? Let's create the problem. And then offer a draconian solution, and when everybody goes, oh, no, you can't do that, then we'll back off a little bit, and we're another step ahead. All right? We saw this in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing. Anti-terrorism legislation, you're going to strip us of liberties, and you can't do this, and we won't do that, and national ID cards. And the thesis was this so-called terrorist attack, which was, again, a homegrown false flag operation, as most of you know. But the perception was we were attacked. The antithesis is the solution, anti-terrorism laws. And at that time, there were enough people concerned with civil liberties that they were, wait a minute, we don't want to do it, So they watered it down. And then they went ahead and passed it anyway, so they're already a step ahead. Now, of course, most of the draconian steps that they wanted in this anti-terrorism legislation back in '95, when the Oklahoma City bombing took place, is now with us thanks to the Patriot Act. So, how are they going to stop the spread of communism? The only chance they had was to stop communism in Europe, particularly militarily, was Germany. So, they reached down and located a lowly German army intelligence agent by the name of Adolf Hitler, who was scrounging around, a ne'er-do-well, couldn't do very well with his painting or his wallpapering. So he started making extra money, working for the German army, acting as an intelligence agent and infiltrating German political parties. So one day they sent him to the German Workers' Party. And he came back and reported to his superiors and said, you're going to like these guys. They think we were stabbed in the back in World War II by Jews, and they want rearmament, and they want to make Germany great again, and they are violently anti-communist. And so the military says, hey, this is good. So they started giving him money, and he started building up the German Workers' Party until in 1920, when he changed the name from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And again, it was almost identical to the agenda of the communists, except it could be held within national boundaries. National socialism. Now, in German, it's Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, which means the National Socialist German Workers' Party. But if you'll notice, in National Socialistic, they took the NA and the ZI out of that word, and so the acronym for National Socialism is Nazi. So when we're talking about a Nazi, we're talking about one who adheres to the philosophy of National Socialism. Right off, he started getting big funding. And the German people were pushed into the hands of Hitler by the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, both of whom had been assets of J.P. Morgan. This was supposedly to wring war reparation out of the Germans, but in reality, no final definite amount of reparations was never ever named, so it was just open-ended. You're going to pay us from now on. They, of course, split Germany up. They took some of their French territories away from them, and mostly under the Dawes and Young Plan, this meant that German industries were now coming under the control of foreign investors, and this so angered the Germans that they all rushed to Hitler. The Bank of International Settlements was handling all this, and it was run by the very globalists who had created communism. feeding into the buildup of Nazi Germany were Dillon Reed, National City Bank, Union Banking Corporation of the United States. Union Banking Corporation was handling the money of a German steel magnate, Fritz Thyssen, who has admitted and revealed that he was the primary financier of Adolf Hitler. And who was handling Fritz Thyssen's money for the Union Banking Corporation? Prescott Bush, the grandfather of President Bush. Funding was also coming from the Bank of England. Now, we also even look beyond the banks that were supporting Germany, and we find out that the large German corporations led by I.G. Farben, whose names I'm sure you'll recognize, Farben, Bosch, Daimler-Benz, Siemens, Krupp, Alliance, which by the way is still the largest insurance company in the world and the primary insurer of the World Trade Center. It wasn't insured by Prudential, okay? It was insured by Alliance and Swiss Re, these same people. Now look at who was supporting them all the way in America. General Aniline and Film, which we know as GAF, was actually a subsidiary of I.G. Farben. And IBM under Thomas Watson supported the Nazis and helped them all the way through the war. When the war started, they did close down their German operation, but the punch cards necessary to run the computers so that the Nazis were able to round up dissidents, homosexuals, Jews, and make them and get them on the train schedules on time, all came from these punch cards that were made exclusively for the Nazis by IBM, and it was all funneled through their office in Warsaw, Poland. And IBM to this day hedges and fudges on their participation in World War II. Any of you that are interested in World War II, like me, as a young boy, you go out and you may have a big library about World War II, but go back and look at it closely. It's about the battles. It's about the generals. It's about the uniforms. It's about the weaponry. Oh, wow, do we like to look at those pictures of those Messerschmitts? Do we like to look at those pictures of those Tiger tanks? But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, as I did, why did all this happen? Why did all this happen? Okay? And my big question then, and we'll get back to this, is how could the German people, who in the 1930s were among the most educated, cultured, sophisticated people in the world, how could they allow themselves to get sucked into this nightmare of Hitler and his Nazis? Well, look around you, folks. It's happening today. 1936, Time magazine referred to the Schroeder, Rockefeller and Company investment bankers as the economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis. But see, that was before the war. Once the war started, you don't hear about any of this. And the attorneys for the Nazi Schroeder Bank were John Foster and Alan Dulles of the New York law firm Sullivan Cromwell. And remember those two names, because as we will see, they continue right through. Another area that nobody much likes to look at is the occult aspects of the Third Reich. Hitler was put into power, supported, and funding by the Thule-Gesellschaft, or the Thule Society, which was a secretive German order that could be traced back to the old Teutonic Knights, which were a creation of the Knights Templars. And as such, they had esoteric knowledge, and they sought more esoteric knowledge. We've all seen the Indiana Jones movies. They're after the Ark of the Covenant. They're after this, that, and the other thing, and they were. So they began to support Hitler, but then Hitler got out of hand. They had the same problem they had had with communism. They created communism, but then they realized they'd created a Frankenstein monster. So they turn around and back Hitler to act as a block against the spread of communism. And now they find out they've created another Frankenstein monster because those Germans, they're just a little too efficient. First thing you know, they've overrun Poland and the Low Countries and France, and now they're threatening Britain. Britain, who Hitler had hoped to have as allies in the fight against communism and against the Russians. Okay, and this is why at Dunkirk, he did not destroy the British Army. He allowed it to escape back to Britain because he was counting on them to be allies. And the British royalty and the Bank of England and these bankers, financiers, and the globalists were all for it. But at some point, probably after the fall of France, they realized that Hitler's getting out of control. And at certain levels, they began to turn against Hitler. And Winston Churchill was one of their minions who they let known that we need a war, we need to stop Hitler. Winston Churchill himself wrote that he had no problem with National Socialism. What he was wanting to stop were the German people. They didn't want the Germans to run everything because after all, it was American and British capital that had started the whole thing in the first place. So in 1941, we have the spectacle of Rudolf Hess, his deputy Führer, his second in command, flying to England on a peace mission. And they admitted this at the time, but what happened is that even though he overflew some RAF bases and nobody came up to stop him, in other words, indicating that there was some sort of prearrangement going on here, and Hess did not just do this on himself. He had his ME-110 personally modified by Dr. Willie Messerschmitt. He had his whole way plotted down. He had made contact with people in England. He was going to land. They were going to put him in touch with the British King, King George VI. They were going to oust Churchill, sue for peace with Germany, and Germany and Britain were going to become allies in the fight against communism. But Hess screwed it up. He couldn't find his place. He couldn't find the place to land. He ran out of gas. He had to parachute out, and in doing so, he broke his ankle. And then a home guard, or a farmer with a pitchfork came up and captured him and turned him over to the home guard. Well, now the whole thing's out in the open, and what was going to be a big secret peace initiative turned into a huge scandal, and everybody concerned had to hush it up. Hitler said he was an idiot and a madman and disavowed him. He didn't know anything about it, and we now know why. They were trying to conclude peace with England in May of 1941 because the next month Hitler attacked Russia, Operation Barbarossa. And why did he attack Russia? We'll get to that. The interesting point is that, what you'll read in my new book, is that one of the only members of the royal family, the Duke of Kent, was killed in a crash in August of 1942, supposedly trying to land in a seaplane, and he hit a mountaintop. But they've done research, and it seems that this aircraft was actually in the process of taking off, and it was taking off from a place near Caithness, Scotland, where they believe the real Rudolf Hess was being held. There was a whole little shell game going on. Hess was captured. He went into captivity. They secreted him off and held him secretly, and then found a duplicate to take his place, and that duplicate is what they turned over to Churchill, and they put him in the Tower of London, and they held him prisoner, and at some point they might have even brought in another duplicate, okay, because nobody could admit that the British royals were willing to cut a deal with the Nazis because their plan fell apart, and Winston Churchill, even though his position was very shaky, he was the one in charge, and he was pro-war. So the question remains, was the Hess who finally supposedly committed suicide in the 1980s, just as he was about to be released from Spandau prison, was he the same pre-war Rudolf Hess? Now, it's not just me or conspiracy theorists that are wondering this. Allen Dulles, at the end of the war, who became OSS chief in in Berlin and later head of the CIA, sent Canadian Dr. Ewan Cameron to Spandau to examine Hess to see if he had signs of wounds that they knew he'd received in World War I. Well, now, why send a Canadian doctor over to examine Hess? Any competent doctor could have checked to see if he had scars on his chest or whatever. Well, Ewan Cameron was not just any doctor. He was a psychologist, psychiatrist, and one of the founders of MK Ultra, mind-controlled experiments. And Alan Dulles, when he sent him over there, he said, "We have reason to believe this is not the real Hess." So you had all kinds of skullduggery going on. Interestingly enough, when Cameron gets over there and the British happened to be, they would switch off. The Russians would guard Hess, and then the Americans would guard Hess, and then the British would guard Hess. He happened to go over there when the British were guarding Hess, and they refused to let him examine the Hess that was in prison. Another thing that's kind of telling is that when they brought Hess up to the Nuremberg war crimes trial and tried to question him about his associations, his activities, he couldn't remember. He had lost his memory. Couldn't remember anybody. Couldn't remember his old friends, How convenient for someone who wasn't Hess. So here's a whole nother issue that we know very little about. But the reason Hess went to England, the reason they were trying to get a peace agreement going with Britain at that time was because Hitler indeed was preparing to attack Russia. But why did he want to do that? Did he just wake up one morning and say, "I think I'm going to attack Russia"? He said in Mein Kampf back in the 20s that eventually Germany and communist Russia were going to have to fight. They were going to have to face each other. But why did he pick this time? Well, documents coming out of the former Soviet Union that are now becoming public, but still hadn't been told to you, show that Stalin had made the decision that no one in Western Europe was going to voluntarily vote in communism. And the only way they could make Europe communistic was military invasion, and he was preparing to invade Europe in July of 1941. The only force that could possibly stand a chance to stop him was the German military. And even that was chancy because the Russians had millions of men, 10,000 airplanes, 22,000 tanks, including those heavy KV models, and even a few of the new T-34s that were coming online, while the Germans had 3,600 tanks. Most of them Panzer IIs and IIIs, very light tanks. Okay, now if they had waited for the invasion, they wouldn't have stood a chance. So the only chance they had was a preemptive strike. So in June, the month before they knew Stalin was going to invade Europe, they attacked Stalin, and sure enough, they crashed through the Russian lines, encircled whole armies, whole divisions. How were they able to do that? Because the Russians were not in defensive positions, they were in offensive positions. And the thing that tells me this is true is that if you've studied your history, you'll know that any general that even looked wrong at Stalin was stood against the wall and shot. None of the generals in charge of the troops on the Western Front at the time of the attack of Barbarossa were ever shot, demoted, or even criticized. Why? Because they were there, they were doing exactly what Stalin had told them to do. Very interesting. That puts a whole new light on it, doesn't it? And even Hitler, finally, he explained it himself. December the 11th, 1941, during the speech he gave when he was forced to declare war on America because of the attack on Japan and the Japanese Axis Treaty, he said, he enumerated all this strength that Stalin had, and he said, if this had not been kept from being set into motion against the Reich, Europe would have been lost. Whoa, Hitler saved Europe from communism? I was never taught that in school. Where'd that come from? But that facts seem to back this up. So now they're in total war, and now they're really moving to see if they can't not only survive but win. But the war's going against them. In the winter of 42-43, we have Stalingrad. They got stopped there on the Volga, and the whole Sixth Army got taken captive, and the death knell that was the last big offensive of the German army until a few months later, about 5 or 6 months later, in July 43, you had the Battle of Kursk, largest tank battle in history. And at this battle, well, I could go into detail some other time. Read about the Battle of Kursk. It's amazing. The Battle of Kursk actually, as far as I'm concerned, was the turning point of World War II. And of course, it was between the Germans and the Russians, so you never heard anything about it. Largest tank battle in history. And even the Russians knew it was coming. The Germans knew the Russians knew it was coming. It was one of the most stupid battles I've ever heard of. The Russians built defenses 10, 12 miles deep. And the Germans went ahead and attacked anyway, trying to close off a salient, a bulge in the lines there on the Eastern Front. And they damn near succeeded. But they couldn't quite match up, couldn't quite connect. And also about that time, Sicily was invaded, and Hitler started pulling units off the Eastern Front to go and try to protect Italy and southern France. And so basically it kind of ended in a stalemate, but the German military lost 3/4 of their mechanized forces in the Battle of Kursk. And from that point on, they were never, ever again able to gain the offensive and the initiative on the Eastern Front. From then on, it just became, one long fighting retreat back into Germany. That was the turning point of World War II. Meanwhile, Germany was developing all kinds of technological wonders. They had night vision scopes called the Vampire. They had television-guided bombs. They had the V1, the V2, which you all probably are aware of. They were working on a 3-stage A9 rocket that they dubbed the New York rocket. It gives you some idea of what they had in mind there. And they had these super Ju-390 bombers, okay? At the end of the war, in June 29th, 1945, the Washington Post said that RAF officers said they had nearly completed preparations for bombing New York from a colossal airfield near Oslo, Norway. 40 giant bombers with a 7,000-mile range were found on this base, the largest Luftwaffe field I've ever seen, said one officer. And the German ground crew said the planes were held in readiness for a mission to New York. Well, the war is about over. They hadn't even quite finished the airfield. What kind of mission are they talking about? They're talking about dropping an atom bomb on New York. And here's the 1943 feasibility study of an atom bomb blast on the island of Manhattan. Yes, folks, they were a lot further ahead than you've ever been told. And one of the reasons is because we had to make enriched plutonium by the very long, slow process of centrifuges, okay? Apparently, the Nazis had developed a chemical method for enriching uranium. They had the bomb. And in my book, you'll hear firsthand witnesses of people who claim to have seen atom bomb tests done by the Nazis prior to 1945. Well, okay, if they had the atom bomb, then why didn't they drop one on New York or drop one on Paris or London, Okay. By the time they finally were ready to make such a move, it was already the spring of 1945, and Germany was on its knees. They were being pressed from the east by the Russians, pressed from the west by the Allies, and they had no reliable delivery system. The V-10 3-stage rocket was unavailable and unreliable. They couldn't count on that. And the giant base in Norway, which they held on to the very end of the war, even though militarily, strategically, it had no value whatsoever, except this was the base they could have launched a nuclear attack from. And it was not completed. And the third reason that they did not use a nuclear bomb is, think about it, folks. If they dropped an atom bomb on New York or London, would that have ended the war? Would we have sued for peace? No. we would have left no stone unturned in Germany. We would have turned it into a wasteland. We would have probably taken the whole population and marched them off somewhere to a camp. Okay, we would have, the retribution would have been unthinkable. So what did the top Nazi leaders do? They got these uranium bombs. They swapped their uranium bombs to the United States in exchange for immunity. 6 days after the surrender of Germany, the German U-boat U-234, after being passed over by Allied aircraft and not being attacked, which tells you there was probably some kind of prearrangement, surfaced in the Atlantic and was taken captive by the USS Sutton. Here in the bottom picture, you can even see that they're already transferring stuff off the submarine. On this submarine was 3 Japanese officers who committed harikari, and they chunked them overboard before they went into captivity. Also on board was 2 disassembled Me-262s jet fighters and 50 barrels of uranium, along with a Dr. Heinz Schlichter, who was the man who had invented their proximity fuses, along with some of his best fuses. Now at this time, President Roosevelt in early 1945 had already been notified that they did not have enough enriched uranium in the United States but for 1 atomic bomb. And of course they had to test it, and they did. So let's look at the time frame. Early 45, we only had enough enriched uranium for 1 atomic bomb. On May the 14th, 6 days after the German surrender, the U-234 is taken into captivity with 560 kilograms of uranium, which turned up missing. July the 16th, we finally set off our first atomic bomb test at the Trinity site, okay, and it worked. Never forget that more than half the scientists working on the Manhattan Project seriously believed that once you started an atomic reaction, a fission reaction, that you would not be able to stop it. It would ignite the atmosphere and incinerate the world. And they set it off anyway. Whew. Glad we were wrong about that. I tell you that because as we speak in some government lab somewhere probably deep underground, they are tampering with the basic building blocks of the universe. That's a scary thought. So they tested it, it worked. The very same day that they tested it in the morning and found out it worked, later that day, the USS Indianapolis departs from San Francisco carrying bomb components to Tinian. July the 26th, the Indianapolis arrives at Tinian, and just 10 days later, the Enola Gay takes off and bombs Hiroshima with the world's first atomic bomb, a uranium bomb, whereas the bomb they tested at the Trinity site was a plutonium bomb. Why would they drop a uranium bomb that they had not tested? It's because the Nazis had already tested it. They knew it worked. They swapped us, the atomic bombs, for immunity. But it gets worse, because the atomic bombs, that was nothing. They were into other stuff. They had their V-2 rockets, they had all this stuff, and it was all taken out of the hands and out of the control of the German Wehrmacht and of the German power structure. Okay, it was all turned over to the SS. The SS created within Nazi Germany their own little empire, and they were in charge of everything. And SS General Hans Kammler is the guy who ended up in command of all of their exotic weaponry. He told Werner von Braun openly that he was going to turn over the V-2s and the V-2 scientists to the Americans in exchange for immunity. And yet, as we all know, that didn't happen. He disappeared after telling von Braun, I'm going to disappear, and he did, although there are rumors he was seen in the United States after the war. And we know that the Patton's army going through Bavaria and on into Czechoslovakia picked up the V-2 rockets and the rocket scientists, including von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and the rest. So what did Kammler have that was even more enticing to the Allies than V-2 rockets? Well, he had flying saucers, for one thing. And these saucers, some of them did not fly using jet propulsion. There was a secret Nazi research facility in Poland near the German border. Here you can see what's left of it today. And I would point out this very strange structure right here. Was that, at first they thought maybe it was a test for helicopters or something, but that didn't work out. And then they found all this extensive cabling going into it, insulated wiring. Was that a superconductor? And this gets into some strange stuff. In the drawing up here, you'll see what witnesses described as what they were working on. They called it Die Glocke, the bell. And it was rotating vortex energy. They were creating energy fields. And any of you that have looked into UFOs, you know that that's the UFO propulsion, rotating energy fields. The picture is a duplicate bell, a rotating energy plasma generator that they're working on at Warsaw's Institute of Plasma Research and Laser Microfusion. So they found out there are a lot of attributes to this, including the possibility of creating wormholes in time and space. Time-traveling Nazis. How do you like that? Sounds like a bad sci-fi movie, but folks, it was real. Now this leads us into the white powder of gold. Does everybody know about the white powder of gold? Yeah, a little bit, maybe not. Under certain circumstances, when you get monatomic matter, that's single atom elements, heavy elements of gold and silver, and when under certain circumstances, when you spin them, the nuclei begin to come apart and change and alter and mutate, and it changes composition. This has been studied at several universities, and a guy by the name of David Hudson in 1988 actually obtained 11 patents on what he called ORME, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. Interestingly enough, ORME is ancient Hebrew for the tree of life. Oh, thank you. Actually, I got one here, I just wasn't using it. You can find all this in gold, silver, copper, platinum, all these heavy metals, all of which are conductors for energy. Now, to show you this isn't just some wild rambling, here's just a few of the scientific papers that have been published talking about the atomic structure and the ability to change the formation and to modify the nuclei of atoms. We're talking about, this is what I was talking about, this is the basic building blocks of the universe, energy. And if you can alter energy at the atomic and subatomic level, then you can just about do anything. Now, let's quickly take a look through history to find out, is this really stuff that we're just now finding out? No, this is something that's known throughout history. We know that the alchemists were all trying to change base metals into gold. They knew somehow, probably from ancient writings, that you could mutate the atomic structure and you could create gold. In fact, Irenaeus Philalethes, whoever, a 17th century alchemist, wrote our stone, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, which, by the way, some people have equated to the Holy Grail, is the philosopher's stone. Some people have speculated the philosopher's stone is a meteorite or some object from space. But he wrote, our stone is nothing but gold adjusted to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation of very fine powder. Now let's go back further in history, and we find the ancient Egyptians had what they call the shamanan, the mahfuz, the manna, the white powder gold, the conical bread. Okay, and it was said that this was given to the pharaohs on their journey to the afterlife, and that at each step along the way to the afterlife, they would stop and say, "What is it?" Because they didn't know what it was. It had been handed down to them from ancient gods. We can find it mentioned in the Bible, but not by that name. As the Israelites came out of Egypt, led by Moses, who we are told was steeped in Egyptian lore and knowledge and knew about this stuff, they wandered in the wilderness, and how were they sustained? They'd wake up in the morning and there was a fine white powdery substance lying on the ground. And they would ask, "What is it?" And in Hebrew, what is it? The word is manna. This was the manna from heaven. And they would mold it into little cakes, they'd heat it up, they'd eat it, and that's how they sustained themselves, because what they have found with monatomic gold is it not only has healing properties, it actually cleans up your DNA. Now, it's also said that the Ark of the Covenant contained white powder. This is where they carried the white powder. And this white powder obviously had a power of its own. And it's been honored down through the centuries. In this painting of a Knights Templar meeting, we see the Ark is venerated, and in the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, we find the Masons still revere the Ark of the Covenant. So let's take just a half minute and look at the Ark of the Covenant. We know from the Bible description, the dimensions, we know the lid of the mercy seat was 3.5 inches thick and made of pure gold. And folks, that weighed 2,714 pounds. How does 4 people pick up more than a ton and carry it around? Well, they don't. What we now know, because it was filled with white powder, and they have found with this white powder of gold, when you put it on a weighing pan and heat it, that it weighs less than it did before you even put it in the pan. The pan weighs less too. So it not only has anti-gravity properties, but it can transmit those properties to whatever it's sitting in. In the late 1980s at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, they cooled a ceramic superconductor by liquid nitrogen to produce a magnetic cushion and floated this round magnet. So we've already duplicated this effect in the laboratories. So they weren't carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they were just guiding it along. And with this superconducting and this extremely atomic, subatomic material, they were able to communicate. Remember, they heard sounds coming from the seat. They were able to maybe even, if you'll remember the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Meshach, Abednego, and he built the gold place, and they went in and they said, are they in there? And they said, well, the 3 Hebrew priests are in there, but there's also a 4th person in there. Well, where'd he come from? And they said, and Nebuchadnezzar says, who is that? He said, well, it's the Son of God. Oops, did they create a wormhole? Did they create some kind of portal, dimensional time portal? And of course, then we have the famous story of Moses coming down from the mountains, and the people of Israel knew that gold was somehow magical, but they didn't know how it worked, because only the priests, only the knowledgeable ones knew the real secrets. And he got angry, and he took the calf which they had made and burned it with fire, ground it to a powder, and made them drink it. Well, now wait a minute, we can't be talking about molten gold, because if you try to make somebody drink molten gold, you're going to kill them. No, he was reducing it to the powder and giving it to them to improve their DNA and maybe sharpen up their brains a little bit so they would begin to understand what was going on. Mount Horeb in the southern Sinai is also known as the Mount of Moses. And in 1904, the British archaeologist Sir William Petrie discovered what he called an ancient Egyptian temple on Mount Horeb. And nearby, they found ancient gold mining operations. And Petrie and his people, when they were exploring there, they lifted up the flagstones, and what do they find but white powder, a white powder. They didn't know what it was, so they left it open, and it all blew away. Was this the powder? Of course it was. And the wealth of the Israelites gathered in Egypt, along with their knowledge of such things, finally was put to rest in Jerusalem in Solomon's temple. And researchers have said that Solomon's temple was a carbon copy of a Sumerian temple dedicated to their god Ninurta and constructed almost 1,000 years previously. How many of y'all have read Sitchin? You know about the Anunnaki and you know about, there you go. This information came from Samaria down into Egypt thanks to the patriarch Abraham, and that gave rise to the Egyptian civilization, which, if you know about Egyptology, just seemed to spring from nowhere, full blown, and then instead of evolving upward, it devolved. So the earliest of the Egyptian stuff was the best. In the back of the Solomon's temple was the little area where they kept the ark, and that was the worship area. And the front was like this huge barn-like thing. Well, what was that for? That was to hold the treasure, because when they came out of Egypt, Moses told them, take everything you need, meaning clothing and food, but they took that to mean take anything that wasn't nailed down. And they took gold and silver, and they took a lot of riches, and then for 40 years they went through the wilderness, conquering one city-state after another. And as was the custom of the day, when you whipped somebody, you took their wife, their children, you took all their goods, you took their gold and silver. And so, after a while they got tired of schlepping that through the desert, and they finally stored it in Solomon's temple. And the Solomon's treasure was the legendary and the greatest treasure in the history of the world. Man, I'm running out of time. I'm barely there. I better get moving. So what happened to it? The Romans attacked Jerusalem. They got a portion of it. They took it back to Rome. 400 years later, Alaric the Goth sacked Rome, and they carried it back to their home grounds in the Languedoc region of southern France. That gave rise to the Cathars, and then to the French aristocrats, including St. Bernard, who fomented the First Crusade to bring freedom and democracy to the Middle East. No, not really. No, they were going after the rest of the treasure. So they went and they excavated under the Temple of Solomon for 9 years, and they got the rest of the treasure that had been hidden there, and they brought it back to southern France. So all of a sudden, Solomon's treasure was reunited in southern France. That, of course, brings us to the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, which I won't go into, but it all had to do with this fabulous treasure, which even Father Saunier probably did not discover, but he did discover some of the genealogies and at least got on the track of the great treasure. But what happened to the treasure? Hitler's top commando was Otto Skorzeny. Here he is when he rescued Mussolini off the mountaintop. And by the way, this gave Hitler the excuse. Italy changed sides and decided they were going to join the Allies. So they had imprisoned Mussolini. Otto Skorzeny goes in, rescues him, takes him back to Hitler. Hitler declares Mussolini still the legitimate ruler of Italy, and the war went on in Italy. And right up to the end of the war, we were fighting in Italy, but we weren't fighting the Italians, we were fighting the Germans. March 1944, because of all that, Hitler said, I have to protect the vulnerable underbelly of Europe. So at that point, northern France had been occupied. Southern France had been Vichy France, and it was they put on the show like it was an autonomous region. But at that point, in September 43, Hitler says, no, I got to protect all of Europe. So they sent the troops and occupied all of France, all the way down into southern France, into the Languedoc region. And in March of 44, SS troops led by Skorzeny entered the Languedoc and then set up camp near the Cathar fortress of Monsignor. And on March the 16th, Skorzeny sends Berlin a telegram simply stating, Eureka! I found it. And he signed it with his code name, Narba, which means scar. He had a big scar across his face. The Nazis got Solomon's treasure. Not only the wealth, but the knowledge. The treasure was backpacked out of the mountains of the pyramid, the foothills of the Pyrenees, loaded onto steel railroad cars, taken to Berchtesgaden, where they were initially hidden in the warrens under there, and then the gold was melted down, the silver was melted down, the gems were spread out. When Morton Bormann, Hitler's deputy who took over after Hess, when his wife was arrested in Austria at the end of the war, she had all these ancient gold coins on her. Where did that come from? Roman coins. Came from the Treasure of Solomon. Here is just a portion of the gold that the Allies discovered at Merkers, Germany in 1945. This is what they got. Imagine what got away. And this was because of Action Adlerflut or Action Operation Eagle Flight. Eagle Flight out of Germany. Morton Bormann, Schmitz, the head of IG Farben, who, by the way, held as much stock in Standard Oil as the Rockefellers, along with these corporations, were moved everything worth anything out of Germany through the rat lines that were augmented significantly by the Vatican. Many of them used Vatican papers to obtain visas from the Red Cross, and they moved them out of there. And a lot of people knew what was going on. Why was this allowed? Because at the end of the war, who became High Commissioner of Germany? John J. McCloy, former head of Chase Bank, the very bank that had funded Hitler. And Alan Dulles, who'd been operating out of Italy, then moved in, became OSS chief in Berlin, and began whitewashing the backgrounds of these Nazis. Why? Because they had made arrangements for the atomic bomb. We know that the church went right along with the Nazis, okay? And so they were all for it. And by the way, anybody stop to think that the current pope was a Hitler Youth? So they're still in charge. Governor of California, his father was a Nazi Gauleiter, wore a little Hitler mustache. And Schwarzenegger early on was a big admirer of Hitler, said all kinds of good things about him, and until he got to be governor of California, and then they started talking about running for president. Hide and watch. They'll run him for president. They'll have to change the Constitution, but they'll do that too, because after all, we are a multicultural nation. Boy, I'm running out of time. All right, let's move along. So, John J. McCloy, High Commissioner of Germany. Prescott Bush was still going. He was prosecuted for his holdings in Union Banking Corporation in late 1942, but it kind of went under the radar. Nobody really talked about that much, and they simply fined him a few $1 million and took away all his stock in Union Banking Corporation. And then up to this day, most people didn't even know much about this. You want to know why? Because Prescott might have been a Nazi sympathizer and a corrupt businessman, but he wasn't stupid. In the summer of 1942, right as we were getting heavy into World War II, what does old Prescott do? He creates the United Service Organization, the USO. The USO that all the GIs just loved. Go watch those World War II Hollywood movies. They all go to the USO canteen. Okay, and I know when I was in the Army during Vietnam, we loved the USO. On my way up here, there was a bunch of soldiers traveling on my airplane. I heard them mention the USO. They want to go to the USO. Anyone who's ever served in the military of the United States loves the USO because it's a little piece of home that you'll find when you're far away. Prescott Bush creates the USO. How, I ask you, in the middle of World War II, can they publicly announce that the guy who's created the so beloved USO was actually a Nazi financier? It would have been a propaganda disaster. So they just fined him and slapped his wrist, and he went right on, and now his grandson is our president. In 1963, John F. Kennedy tried to break loose from this financial stranglehold that these international globalist bankers have put upon us, creating communism, then creating the Nazis, leading us into 2 world wars and a Great Depression. He and his Treasury Secretary were trying to curtail the power of the Federal Reserve System, and in June of 1963, Kennedy issued $4.2 billion in United States notes, okay? This was paper money issued through the Treasury, not through the Federal Reserve System that we have to pay interest to. It's really a scam. Congress approves more debt. We authorize the Federal Reserve System to print more money. They spend a few $100s on paper and ink, print up $100 million, and then charge us interest, not on the money they spent on the paper and the ink, but on the $100 million. And that's our national debt, which is now up around $8 trillion and rising, and it's going to get worse. So he issued his own money. You notice it's got red ink on it, 1963 series. And I told you the parallel between he and Lincoln. He became the second president in U.S. history to issue interest-free money. And the first was Abraham Lincoln when he printed greenbacks to finance the war between the states. And folks, I don't think it was just sheer coincidence that both of those men were shot in the head in public. That's what happens to you when you try to thwart those international bankers. Now, after Kennedy's dead, Johnson takes over. Who's his wise men? Who were the people running the show? His 16 wise men, all members of the Council on Foreign Relations, to include Averell Harriman, who was business partners to the Bush, who also financed Hitler. The Rockefellers, Nelson Rockefeller, in World War II was in charge of South America, okay, and saw that the Germans got all the benefit down there, not the British. So in other words, they were down on the Germans, and they let Hitler and Himmler and Goebbels, they let them go, whatever happened to them, but they did not give up on National Socialism. They brought it over here, and they learned from their past mistakes. Richard Nixon got his start from the money from a Nazi named Nikolai Malexa. And with the help of the Dulles brothers, who you may recall were the lawyers for the banks that were funding Hitler, and it's even stated that they were at Baron von Schroeder's house in January of 1933 when they all decided Hitler was going to become the Führer of Germany. They helped release the money of Malexa, some $400 million, and Richard Nixon, a young lawyer who they had picked, got the benefit of that, and that started him on his political career. Now we got the Trilateral Commission, and am I the only one who sees kind of a similarity between the Trilateral Commission logo and the swastika? It's just kind of a stylized swastika. And these are the people who put Jimmy Carter into office. So, you know, when they got mad at the Republicans, then they put Jimmy Carter in. Gunfire decided all U.S. elections between 1964 and 1988, and we may see a revival of that if Hillary Clinton's prediction of an assassination of Obama proves true. But here's the clincher. Starting in 1972, when Nixon pretty well eviscerated the Republican Party, he said, fire everyone except George Bush. And he named George Bush as chairman of the Republican National Committee. They began to infuse within the GOP these ethnic committees. Ukrainians for Nixon, Lithuanians for Nixon. And they were all chock full of Nazis and pro-Nazi fascists who they had brought in who were fleeing from Eastern Europe so they wouldn't be killed by the communists. Of course, they were anti-communist, so that made them okay, because now we're into the Cold War. And this is where they begin to change basic Republican conservatism into what we now know as neo-conservatism, which is nothing more than National Socialism. Nixon's White House counsel, John Dean, said it's been new on Capitol Hill since about 1997, about 3 years after the GOP gained control of the House. It's been new to the White House since 2001 with the arrival of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, although its roots first emerged during the Nixon presidency and began blossoming in the Reagan-Bush senior years. Okay, but he doesn't quite explain what's he talking about. He's talking about the neoconservatives which are the National Socialists, the Nazis. In 1985, y'all may recall that despite protest from veterans groups and from Jewish organizations, President Reagan, under which this Nazi infiltration of the GOP increased thanks to George Bush, goes to Bitburg, Germany, and lays a wreath at the cemetery, which was full of SS officers. They said, you shouldn't be doing that. He did it anyway. Does that not show that they were exerting extreme power? And you're going to love this. Some of you will throw cabbage at me. But the New Age, we hear about all this New Age stuff, and it's really a National Socialist dream come true. Hitler was a vegetarian. Hitler was against hunting. Hitler was against smoking. Hitler was anti-alcohol, believe it or not. Can you imagine somebody trying to run Germany and tell them they can't drink beer? Give me a break. And of course, it didn't work very well either, because they're going to keep drinking. And of course, as the war got worse and worse for them, they smoked and drank all the much more. But back to nature, war on cancer, improved highways, clean water, this was all hallmarks of the Third Reich. And here's what I say: advocating a healthy lifestyle, environmentalism, preaching about that, trying to convince people to do better, that's a good thing. I'm all for you. But when you start passing laws and you're trying to force people to comply by law, that's fascist. All right, I'm going to skim over this because I don't need to tell you that there are 5 corporations that now control everything you see in here. And I'm not talking about the news. I'm talking about books, TV, cable, magazines, you name it. You name it. 5 corporations, and they're all interlocked, and they're all backed by these same National Socialists. But the one I want to point to is the largest publisher in the English language, Bertelsmann AG, which is still a family-owned private corporation out of Germany by the Mohn family. And from 1921 on, Heinrich Mohn was a member of the patrons group supporting the Nazi SS. And during the war, they were the largest publisher for the German Wehrmacht, the military, And today, they're the largest publisher in the English language. I had to take a whole separate slide just to try to list some of their assets. And I'm not going to read all this, except I want you to point out that they own the publishing houses: Random House, Ballantine Books, Del Rey, Fawcett, Bantam, Delacorte Press, Dell, Delta, Broadway Books, Doubleday Religious Publishing, Main Street Books, Alfred Comp, blah, 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 all the way down to History Book Club, Military Book Club, Mystery Guild, Primary Teachers Book Club. Do you see how they've got control over everything we see in here? And do you understand why that you try to get something published that you know is the truth and it doesn't go anywhere? Oh, I'm sorry, we're not really interested in that this year. They know better than to try to publish that. This is total control over the media. And that, of course, creates a real problem. In case you can't read the little Toll cartoon, he's watching TV and it says, in the CBS Viacom deal, look at what you get: movies, MTV, radio, videos, Nickelodeon, news media, theme parks, billboards, Showtime, and just about every kind of entertainment and advertising you could want. And the guy says, well, what about the news? TV says, well, this is the news. And that's right. The news is what they tell you is the news. How many of you think that Ron Paul has dropped out of the presidential race? How many of you think he's dropped out? Well, good. You guys are on the ball, because there's many people who think he has. He hadn't. He's just become what they used to call in the old Soviet Union a non-person, because the media will not talk about him, and they will not push his message along so that you can hear that he's the only choice we've got. Why did I say that? Because behind Hillary was the Bilderbergers. She was the first American First Lady to attend Bilderberger meetings, and she didn't just attend the meeting. I could go attend the meeting of the Bilderbergers, doesn't mean I'm part of them. But she didn't just attend, she was at the front door greeting the members as they came in. which is a time-honored method of introducing their proteges to the membership. She was handpicked, and I wouldn't count her out just yet, okay? Behind Barack Obama, who I say is an empty suit. Oh, he looks nice. He says all the right things, but then think about it. In 2000, George Bush did too. Freedom, motherhood, God, apple pie, says all the right things, but he didn't do it. Didn't do any of it. Hitler said all the right things, absolutely, okay? And behind Obama, who do we find as his senior advisors? Zbigniew Brzezinski and his son, the Trilateral Commission, okay? Brzezinski, who I swear to God wants to start World War III with us against the Russians. He's got a thing against the Russians, okay? And behind John McCain is Henry Kissinger, for God's sakes. And am I the only one who's concerned that John McCain may have a real chance at becoming president and having his finger on the nuclear trigger? And by his own admission, for 5.5 years, he was in the hands of Soviet mind control experts? God almighty. And okay, all right, I know some of the Republicans out there go, oh yeah, well he's a hero, he's POW, he parachuted out of his plane, he's tough, he can overcome that. Well, maybe so, but let's look at his record. John McCain has voted for every aid package to Vietnam. He's voted against and obstructed every investigation into finding out what happened to our MIAs and our POWs. And right now in Hanoi, the only monument that they have to American POWs is to John McCain, okay, who got special treatment. And you go check the website, Vietnam Veterans Against McCain, you'll find that his fellow prisoners dubbed him the songbird because he told them everything they wanted to know. And he's admitted that, okay? All right? And yet they still talk about this guy as if he's a real candidate. It's amazing. It's amazing. I won't bother to read all this, except basically what they're saying is, and it's very true, is that even if J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, even if these people as individuals have become superfluous, the mechanism, the machinery that they have created still lives on and is still as potent as ever and is still fulfilling the functions for which it was created. And this mechanism today has been brought under the control of the fascist globalist who created both communism in Russia and National Socialism in Germany by using the wealth stolen from Europe by the Nazis. They have created a new empire in the United States, a Fourth Reich. And I think they may even be gloating about it and snubbing their nose at us because the most revered occult symbol of the Nazi SS was the black sun. And in the heart of America, in Centennial Park, in Nashville, Tennessee, is this black onyx globe that floats on about a 1/2 inch of water. It's amazing. You can push on it and the whole thing will revolve around. And it's got the continents etched, so they say it's the world. And yet when the sun's out, it glistens with such brightness that you can barely look at it. It's the black sun. It's a World War II memorial donated to Nashville by Germany. Nah, we won. And look where we are today. I'm not even going to talk about the parallels of the Reichstag fire, the Enabling Act, 9/11, the Patriot Act. We're just following right in the footsteps. Military commissions, secret tribunals. Now they can pick you up without a warrant. Now they can hold you without writ of habeas corpus. Everything the Nazis were doing, we are now emulating. Even our stamps are beginning to look like Nazi symbology. Our military guys now look like Waffen-SS troopers wearing those Fritz helmets, okay? And by the way, I just saw a story the other day where the mayor of D.C. has announced a new program of neighborhood security zones, whereby they are going to close off neighborhoods and with police on all the corners. Nobody comes in, nobody goes out unless you show your government-approved identification cards. Can you spell Warsaw Ghetto? They're doing the same stuff, and it's happening to us all over again. And my question, as a young kid studying World War II and reading about the concentration camps and reading about the capos and reading about the way the Jews were treated and the homosexuals and the intellectuals. One of my best friends was the medical examiner in Fort Worth, Texas, Dr. Felix Głódź. He was Polish. He and his wife ended up in Dachau. Okay, he wasn't a Jew. No, he was a free-thinking, intellectual, educated person, and that's who they were throwing in prison. Okay, just like most of the people sitting in this audience today. Are we going to repeat ourselves? Now, I've told you about the rise of the Fourth Reich. I haven't told you about the fall of the Fourth Reich because it hadn't happened yet. And if and when that happens, it's going to be up to you. So let's get after it. Thank you. I love this one. It's not fascism when we do it.